The modern approach is one of the most important approaches in the study of comparative government and politics. Now, before we discuss, let's have a recap of what Group 1 discussed. Group 1 has discussed about the traditional approaches to comparative government and politics. Traditional approaches were widely prevalent until the outbreak of World War II. They were divided into four sub-approaches: the philosophical, the historical, institutional, and legal approach. Now we all know about all the functions of such approaches. And today, we would like to discuss about the modern approaches to the study of comparative government and politics. So, the modern approaches focus on the scientific ways of studying politics, where many thinkers believe that it's a reaction against traditional approaches. In this regard, its first breakthrough comes with the emergence of the behavioral revolution in political science. So they focus on emphasizing factual studies of most political events and try to arrive at a scientific and definite conclusion. So their aim is to replace normativism with empiricism. Therefore, these approaches are marked with empirical data. So, a bit of explanation. Those approaches play vital roles in maintaining appropriate behavior and politics and taking immediate action in society when there are problems within the government, or in other words, problems within a democratic society. So without further ado, here are some of the approaches or the subtypes of approaches which can further describe what are modern approaches. But before we can discuss about the subtypes of modern approaches, here are some of its characteristics. The first, they try to draw conclusion from empirical data. Next, they go beyond the study of political structures and its historical analysis, or in other words, going beyond other political structure parts and derive from its historical analysis, like from the earlier ages, from the Greek civilization up to the present. Third characteristic, they believe in interdisciplinary study. Last but not least, they emphasize scientific methods of study and attempt to draw scientific conclusions in political science. So, in this slide, here is the diagram of the following approaches in modern approach to comparative government and politics. So, as you can see in the screen, it leads to 5 subcategories related to modern approaches. And without further ado, I will turn over to the other members of my group to present about different types of modern approaches in politics.
I am going to tackle about the first types of modern approaches, which is the sociological approach. So, sociological approach is an approach in which it focuses on the individual attempt to understand the society through situating social events in his or her respective environment. For example, social structure, culture, history, and trying to understand social phenomena by collecting and analyzing empirical data. So, in sociological approach, it also concerns with how individuals know what is going on in a society and the events taking place within a society. So therefore, they call it as common sense because many people believe that they understand and the world and the events taking place within it, often justifying by calling it a common sense. However, others don't actually engage in a systematic attempt to understand the social world. So this scientific approach is what differentiates sociological knowledge from common sense. For example, Peter Berger, who is a well-known sociologist, argued that one distinguishes sociology from common sense is that sociologists try to see what is there. They may have hopes or fears concerning what they may find, but they will try to see, regardless of their hopes or fears. It is thus an act of pure perceptions. So in order to obtain sociological knowledge, sociologists must study the world methodically and systematically. They do this through induction and deduction. So with induction, sociologists gather data on the ground and formulate theories about what they find. So for example, you visit your local grocery store daily to pick up necessary items. You notice that on Friday, 2 weeks ago, all the clerks in the store were wearing football jerseys. And again, last Friday, the clerks wore their football jerseys. And today, also Friday, they're wearing them again. So from just these observations, you can conclude that on all Fridays, these supermarket employees will wear football jerseys to support their local team. So these juries are then tested by using the scientific method in order to assess the jury's validity. So in order to test a jury's validity, they utilize that deduction. So the deduction is the act of evaluating the juries in light of the new data. So this is the deduction, reasoning, or the deduction. So knowledge can also move the opposite direction. So say that you read in the news about a tradition in a local grocery store where employees wear football jerseys on Fridays to support the home team. So this time, you'll start from the overall rule and you would expect individual evidence to support this rule. So each time you visited the store on a Friday, you would expect that the employees will wear jerseys. So in conclusions, sociological knowledge is produced through a constant back and forth between empirical observation and jury decision. So in this way, sociology is more rigorous than common sense because sociologists test and modify their understanding of how the world works through scientific analysis.
Now for the additional information, sociological approach to politics may be concerned with the sociological analysis of political phenomena, which can range from the state and civil society to the family, investigative topics such as citizenship, social movements, and the sources of social power. Now, there are many thinkers that make up the term of sociology, like Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and the other thinkers like Anthony Giddens, Georgian Habermas, and Michael Mann. So this approach was traditionally concerned with how trends, dynamics, and structures of domination can affect formal political processes, or in other words, affect the development of how the government can pass laws regarding to anti-crime, even policies on abortion, even divorce, so on and so forth, as well as exploring how various social forces which will work together to change political policies. So, from that perspective, we can identify some of the major theoretical frameworks like pluralism, elite, or managerial theory, and as well as class analysis, which can overlap with the analysis given from Karl Marx. So, pluralism can see politics primarily as a contest among competing interest groups, while elite or managerial theory is sometimes called a state-centered approach. So, this explains what the state does by looking at constraints from organizational structure, semi-autonomous state managers, and interests that can arise from a state as a need and power-concentrated organization.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my topic is all about psychological approach. Psychological approach is one of the modern approaches. Psychological approach. So this is an approach focusing on understanding the politics, politicians, and political behavior from the perspective of psychology. So there is a strong link between psychology and politics, which means that psychology and politics are connected to each other. They are related to each other. So we all know what psychology means. In politics, psychologists usually study the political behavior. They also study why certain individuals behave in a certain way. In simple terms, psychology studies the behavior, the attitudes of the voters, the attitudes of the politicians, and after studying various aspects, the researchers draw conclusions which very often serve as the purpose of political leaders. So, we are aware that if a person, if mosul siya into politics, na siya mga, na siya purpose, na siya motives nga nung mo-enter siya into politics. So, mo na kanang i-determine ni psychologist kung nga nung mo na behavior sa that person nga nung enter siya into politics. So, political scientists are eager to know how motives and emotions work in the field of political activity. Political scientists use the insights of psychology to analyze a political leader or voter's behavior, or to explain why some people are more prone to supporting certain government and ideologies. So there are motives, likes and dislikes in every type of political activity. So which means that politics cannot be isolated from psychology because they are connected with each other. Psychological approach attempts to understand such political events by asking fundamental questions about how and why people engage with political processes and structures. Why do people vote the way they do? So, what is the appeal of the political ideologies to which some devote their lives? How do people understand politics in every sense? So, those questions, the answer to those questions can be quite different depending on what psychological approach you take. So, the different psychological approach are the personality, social identity, and social constructionist approach. So, to summarize, psychological approach is to study the behavior of the politicians, the voters, and other people related to politics. Thank you.
So in this approach, there are a lot of influences that make up this approach. Like, for example, there are a lot of changes in behaviors like racist behavior, voting attitudes, motivation, voting, role of the media, including nationalism, political extremism, so on and so forth. Of course, this also includes behavior by individuals in terms of how they behave and even relate their
principles of planning, which has recently become part of the governmental activity, are only done by the government personnel, such as the president, prime ministers, and other government officials. This obvious relationship of the two has placed the economic approach in a suitable position. Economic approach is also all about the politics, decisions, and the thing that they have in the politics, the government, and the primary aim of economic approach is to understand the interdependent relationships between the people itself, nag-govern sa government, i-govern sa mga politicians, and the context motivated or influenced by the beliefs, some learning strategies, cognition, and perception from the other people.
So, this approach has highlighted the centrality of our relations to the composition of rural population. So, when a class-based analysis of access to rural resources contributed to understanding the present institutional power, so the wider discussion of the structures of the population of power, which prompted government officials to widen their policies on economy and of course the maintenance of supply and demand of such products in order to keep the economy skyrocketed in a specific country. But if the supply and demand are probably unstable, there could be an economic crisis, and even worse, the customers might not be able to buy something important, personal needs, and even of course their basic needs at home and even at school, like for example their tuition fees, food, clothing, water, and even for all the bills they need to step up in order to minimize such catastrophic consequences of the economy.
Good morning, everyone. My topic is all about quantitative approach. This approach is belong to traditional approach. So it means that quantitative, when we say it can visualize easily the talks about numbers. So in politics, this approach focuses on different techniques in collecting quantitative data through research, inquiry, and data gathering. But in political scientists, they argue that data is collected through multiple methods, which includes the experiments, with the experiments, content analysis, and surveys. This approach is a process of inquiry to identifying the problem based on testing a theory, and it could be through numbers gathering and analyzing the statistical techniques.
So in this approach, there are many important things to remember when it comes to using this approach in the field of political science. So quantitative methods play major roles in improving on commonly used research tools within the structure of regression models, which will be frequently used in the field of politics. So this is taken from the word quantitative, which can be defined as a process of inquiry, examining and identifying problems that that's based on testing a theory measured by numbers and analyzed with statistical techniques. Of course, there are researchers who tend to use quantitative research to record their data and then interpret it in their thesis. But when it comes to politics, they play major roles on improving commonly used research tools, which can be used in real life situations.
Hi everyone, my name is Dayan Biggs Malanis and my topic is all about the system approach. This approach makes an attempt in explaining relationship of political life with the other aspect of social life. In this approach, a political system operates within the social environment and accordingly, it's not possible to analyze any political events being isolated from other aspects of the society. In other words, economic, religious, and other influence shape up the political process. Kinesha is all about the conditional approach is nagtalk about the relationship of the people and the government. For example, in the Philippines, we're a democratic country and we're free to do what we want and freedom is everywhere. And for second example is like ako makasuloy ko sa bisag asa maski walay authority sa government makapost ko sa Facebook without regulating what I posted.
So the systematic approach in politics is helpful in studying changes like transformation, feedback, exchange, tension, conflict, and development. So there are many experts who have made such studies like Gabriel Almond, Tom Parsons, Carl Deutsch, Morton Kaplan, and others, etc. So the system approach analyzes interactions, structures, institutions, and of course processes pertaining to politics. So politics, however, may involve power, authority, physical coercion, and allocations of values for society. So as such, the one political system can't be physically separated from non-political aspects, and it can be understandable and studied in an analytical manner. So that's all for the subtypes of modern approaches to politics. So for the conclusion of our report, modern approaches play critical roles in maintaining appropriate behavior in politics and taking immediate action in society when there are problems within the government. Like, for example, problems within the economy, problems with corruption, problems with other problems within the government. They need to take immediate action. Of course, they've done that like through impeachment or even through high-profile cases which can be considered as criminal cases. So, without these approaches, the government will have difficulty dealing with unrest among people and even riots. So, compared with traditional approaches, they both have merits and demerits. So, along with traditional approaches, modern approaches play various roles in administering political systems of the government. So as previously mentioned earlier, they do focus on methods of empirical data which replaces normativity. So they also focus on something being used which is based on further developments in any of the fields which are the following: science, engineering, and social studies. So we all know that the modern approaches play various roles, and of course, as there are possible skills in which we can administering so many laws and even maintaining public order and security within the respective country. So whenever there's a possible crime going on, whether in the family, in the what do you call this, the government, and even within a specific company, the government may need to rely on law enforcement in order to keep the community safe from such threat. Also, modern approaches are fact-based, and they can even lay emphasis on factual studies of political phenomena to arrive at scientific and definite conclusions, as previously mentioned. So, as of today, there are a lot of political scientists who seem to be more interested in analyzing how people behave in matters related to state and government. We all know that the state is responsible for recognition of their sovereignty of a specific country, even when it comes to territorial borders, even protection against all kinds of danger, including terrorism, war, crime, organized crime, etc. Even in a type of government, the leader should be more responsible when it comes to leading a country to more prosperity development. Like for instance, boosting the economy, passing appropriate laws, and even, of course, maintaining the respect of other politicians for multiple groups, like legislative, executive, and judicial, something like that. So, in all probability, that will be all for the report, and we'll let the last part to tackle about the other approaches of modern approach. So, that will be all for this report. Thank you for listening.